Steve Cuden here. Today we're doing something a bit different on StoryBeat. The usual script is being flipped on me. In honor of our hitting 300 episodes, my producer Casey Georgi is going to interview me about the show and how it's evolved over 7 wonderful years of creative expression. I hope you'll enjoy our chat.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment.
Thanks for joining us on a special edition of StoryBeat. I'm Casey Georgi, and I'll be your host today. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Steve Cuden, produces and usually hosts this podcast. Among Steve's 300-plus guests are such notables as Bryan Cranston, Cary Elwes, Michael Dorn, Melody Thomas Scott, Rob Marshall, Andy Tennant, Hawk Koch, George Newbern, Karen Ziemba, Robert Cuccioli, Phil Proctor, Madeline Smith Osborne, and Austin Pendleton. Steve has also interviewed the following people live before enthusiastic crowds, but not for StoryBeat: William Shatner, Bryan Cranston, Cary Elwes, and Billy Porter. Steve is perhaps best known for co-creating the hit Broadway and international musical Jekyll and Hyde, writing the show's original book and lyrics with noted composer Frank Wildhorn. Jekyll and Hyde has been produced on Broadway twice and enjoyed 4 U.S. national tours. Having been translated into close to 30 languages, Jekyll and Hyde has been staged in numerous venues throughout the U.S. and world over. Steve wrote 90 teleplays for popular TV shows such as X-Men, The Batman, Iron Man, Shaolin Showdown, Gargoyles, The Mask, The Pink Panther, Goof Troop, Quack Pack, RoboCop, Biker Mice from Mars, Godzilla, Extreme Ghostbusters, and numerous others. Steve directed and co-produced the cult favorite horror comedy feature Lucky, winning Best Director at the No Dance Film Festival. Lucky also won 4 Best Feature awards at film festivals in the U.S. and around the world. Steve has authored 2 popular books on writing: Beating Hollywood, Tips for Creating Unforgettable Screenplays, and Beating Broadway, How to Create Stories for Musicals That Get Standing Ovations. For more, please visit stevecuden.com and storybeat.net. For all those reasons and many more, it's a pleasure to welcome to StoryBeat today, Steve Cuden. Steve, welcome to your show.
It's such a pleasure to be on my own show.
How does it feel to be on the other side?
It's a little strange, to be honest with you. And it's very interesting to hear what I always say at every show said by somebody else. So that was very amusing. Thank you.
So let's start at the beginning. What was the moment when you realized you wanted to work in film?
Well, I've known that since I was a little boy, ever since I was consuming the Three Stooges and the Marx Brothers and Popeye cartoons and reading comic books, Batman, Superman, Marvel comics, since I was, before I can remember, really. When I was a little kid, I was a true boob tube kid and grew up in that generation that was the first, really, to be completely consumed by TV. I was consumed by it. And I was involved in theater since I was a little kid, since I was about 8 years old. So I've always wanted to work in show business, and I've always wanted to be in the entertainment side of show business, not necessarily behind the scenes, though I've done an awful lot of that too, because I've also done some acting in my life. So the answer is I've always wanted it. The one movie in particular that made me absolutely want to work on movies was the James Bond movie Goldfinger. When I saw that in the theater way back in the 60s, I'm dating myself, but way back in the 60s, that was the one where I went, oh, I want to do that.
I want to go back. You mentioned acting as a young kid. What was the first play that you were in?
The first one I can remember was when I was at summer camp. And we used to go to a summer camp called Camp Kiwanee here in Pennsylvania. They would do various productions over the course of the summer. And the first time I can ever remember being on stage was in a production of Guys and Dolls with all boys. There were no girls at this camp, so it was all young boys playing the various characters in Guys and Dolls. And that taste of being in front of people with the lights on you and having the audience respond, that really got under my skin. And I, ever since then, been unable to get that out from under my skin.
Got it. So you were bit by the theater, the film bug. When did your career really take off?
Well, there's an assumption in the question that my career actually took off. My career has been a slow boil for a very long time. If you're going to say it took off, it really took off in the 1990s, in the early 1990s when I started to write cartoons. But I've been struggling at it for now more than 50 years. And so a good example would be I graduated as a BA in theater from the University of Southern California in 1978. And I didn't find real work, true work that was of substance and paid well for another 13 years. I struggled for a long time in Los Angeles. And I designed lighting in the theater for lots of famous people. I designed 3 shows for John Cassavetes, and I designed a show for Mimi Leader, if you know who that is. She's a well-known director, and various others. And then, of course, Jekyll and Hyde is out there, and I had been working on Jekyll and Hyde from 1980 through 88 when I was replaced by a more famous writer named Leslie Bricusse, which is a very common occurrence in the theater to be, one person replaces another. When that took off, that wasn't really until 1997. So somewhere in the early 90s, to answer your question, my career took off, if you want to call it that.
How did you get involved with Jekyll and Hyde? Like, how did you get your foot in the door of that production?
So that was my having met Frank Wildhorn when he was invited to have a show of his called Christopher, produced at USC back in 1979. And I was the master electrician for the drama department at the time. And because I put the show up, I actually installed the show, and then I operated the computer board for that production in the large theater at USC called the Bing Theater. After opening night, Frank spent the next couple of weeks at every performance in the booth with me while I was operating the show. And I sat there and would criticize his show quite heavily. I would kind of actually rag on him about some of the problems that I saw in it. And he would laugh at everything I had to say. And he said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I want to be a writer. That's a deadly phrase, by the way, for most people that are in the arts. You don't want to be anything. You are something. You've got to tell people you are something. You've got to say you are a writer. But that's a lesson I learned the hard way. I wanted to be a writer at the time. I had written this, that, and the other little tiny piffle of things, including I had taken 7 of Aesop's fables and turned them into rhymed verse in what I thought of as a children's play called Aesop Over Easy.
Oh, how adorable.
I told him about that, and he said, let me see that. So I gave him a copy of Aesop Over Easy, and he came back the next day and said, you're a lyricist. I said, I am. He said, you are. So we started getting together and working from that point on for quite some time, for the next almost 10 years. And the first thing that we wrote together was 20-song set that was designed for an album. Never got produced for real. We did a demo of it, but it was called The High and Mighty Caesar. It was a 20-song set about Julius Caesar, if you can imagine that having any impact on the world. I cannot. We thought at the time, how clever of us, Because of Jesus Christ Superstar, we thought we'll do Julius Caesar.
Sure.
And then we wrote a musical based on the story of Nicholas and Alexandra, the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia. And that was called The Last Tsar. And that went absolutely nowhere. And then in 1990, about 18 months after a show had come out on Broadway called Sweeney Todd, written by Stephen Sondheim, we were both in love with that show, and why don't we come up with something that's gothic and horror and bloody and all that good stuff. So we sat around and for a while talked about different shows to produce or write. And so we talked about, we talked about The Phantom of the Opera 7 years before Lloyd Webber, and we thought that'll never work. What a great thought that was. And we looked at Frankenstein and Dracula And then I said, why don't we do Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because it has an opportunity for one man who's two characters with two different love interests, a girl from the upper crust and one with a girl from lower society. He said, that's a great idea. And off to the races we went. And that's how we got to Jekyll and Hyde.
Wow, that's so interesting. I actually did not know that journey. So it's great to have some of that background. So you're a writer at this point.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, right. But you are a writer. And so what are the essential elements a screenwriter should consider when creating a script?
Well, there's two ways to look at it, really. One is you can come at it from a story or a plot perspective first, or you can come at it from a character perspective first. And I think the better way to come at it is from character out, though in my case, frequently it is plot that hits me first. I've got an idea for a story that's compelling in some way. But the key, the essential element that anyone that's trying to write a screenplay or a fictional novel or some kind of really intense story that's studying people or characters is that you need to put a single character that we typically call the protagonist or the hero. Same thing. Protagonist and hero are interchangeable. And they must then have a powerful goal that they find early on in the story, what we typically call the inciting incident. And once that powerful goal is set, then you must put a myriad of obstacles in their way, which we call conflict, until they somehow reach the resolution to that goal. The resolution does not need to be positive. It can be negative. There are lots of good examples of negative resolutions in movies. Good example would be The Godfather. Good example would be Chinatown, etc. There are plenty of good examples of not positive or happy outcomes. But you need that single character in search of the powerful goal with lots of obstacles in the way. When you do that, you form what's called the spine of a story, and then the audience can attach themselves to whoever your protagonist is, and then follow them through his or her struggle to reach that resolution. And that must be in pretty much every single memorable popular story there is. When you have an ensemble of characters or a buddy story, like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or Thelma and Louise, or 48 Hours, or a buddy story like that, or an ensemble story like The Big Chill, or a chorus line, or stories that have ensembles of characters, you still need to find, as a writer, one of those characters. It's actually his or her story that we then follow through all of it. And by doing that, the audience then has something or someone to attach to empathize with. Without that empathy, the audience will quickly get bored and go away.
We like a relatable story or someone that we can be inspired by or root for sure.
We have to have some form of a rooting interest, although the connotation of the word rooting sometimes is overblown, as in it's a crowd at a stadium is rooting for a team, and that's loud and raucous. But the audience is quietly internally rooting for some character to succeed in some way. And the character can be completely dislikable and you'll still want to root for him or her. Great example is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Right.
The principal character in that, Randall Patrick McMurphy, is loathsome as a human being, and yet we follow him and love him by the end.
The anti-hero, if you will, right?
It is an anti-hero. Another good example would be Harry Callahan in Dirty Harry. Mm-hmm. He's not a particularly lovely fellow, but yet we want him to succeed. Mm-hmm. And that's true in every memorable popular story, whether it's a true hero or an anti-hero. You need to have that character with lots of conflict and obstacles in the way.
I'd like to pivot. I'd love to talk about your teaching career. So you were a professor at Point Park University. What did you learn from that experience?
So before I taught there, I had not really ever taught. I'd only taught one course when I was in graduate school at UCLA. And so I was not sure that I was going to be a good teacher And what I did discover is that I do know my subject and I do know how to teach. And I'm reasonably good at communicating how things work. So one of the things I learned in doing that is that I needed to have more patience with students.
Sure.
Because my expectations are fairly high for people, and many people are not capable of rising to my expectation in a quicker manner than they are capable. So in other words, people have to form their path in their own time and way, even though they're caught in the box of a class or a course, which is a time constraint. People need to be able or allowed to freely find their path. And so I did discover in teaching that I'm actually reasonably good at standing up in front of people, something that early in my life I would have done a little trepidatiously. And now obviously I've acted, but that's different than standing up as me, as yourself, and talking to a crowd of people about whatever. And turns out I'm relatively good at it, but I didn't know that until I started to teach. And the last thing that I learned as a teacher is that it's very challenging for anyone who's not lived life very long, i.e., 18, 19, 20-year-old people. It's very hard for them to have a lot of really great stories to tell because they haven't lived long enough to have great stories to tell.
Right.
So for a writer to become solid takes a lot of practice, a lot of writing pages, but it also takes a lot of living life. So my advice to anyone who's listening to this today, who may be, let's say, 22, 23 years old or younger, give yourself the space to go out and live life and find not just your pace, your path, but to find things about life that interest you so that you can dig into those and research those and live those so that you can then translate that life into words on a computer or paper or however it winds up. That's maybe the most important lesson of all, is that people have to live life in order to have stories to tell.
What would that look like? What would you like these teens who are exploring what they're interested in to do to become more creative, to find their sense of story?
Well, they have to find patience within their own being. I can remember when I was that age, I was very anxious to get on with it. I want to have a career. I want to have it now. I want to be good now.
Sure.
And guess what? It takes a long time to be good at something, especially writing and creating. You can be very creative as a young person, but for sure, to become good at it, really great at it, takes a lot of time and energy and patience and discipline and doing it. And if you don't spend the time doing it, you're not likely to get better at it. Creativity is like a muscle. So if you go to the gym and work out, your muscles will get stronger. It's the same thing with creativity. If you are trying to be a painter or a choreographer or a composer or a writer or an actor or a director, you have to do a lot of it in order to master that craft, that discipline, and you have to keep at it. So for anyone who's young and thinking, I'm frustrated because I'm not at my peak of my career, give yourself time. Don't sweat it, though you need to keep at it. That doesn't mean stop doing it. It means keep at it.
I think that's really great and realistic advice to give. And teaching students how to write, did that impact your writing in some way?
I think it did. So many teachers will say to you, I learn more from my students than I taught them. I think that there's a truth in that, and a lot of it has to do with the fundamentals. If you watch the great athletes, if you watch the great baseball players, the great football players, the great golfers, the great tennis players, they all do what before their events? They all warm up. They all practice. They practice. They practice and they practice. So part of being a good storyteller is understanding the basics and the fundamentals of being a writer. And when you teach it, you are constantly being reminded of it. you're constantly being reminded that this student didn't get this principle or didn't understand how this functions in a way. So that then informs you, the teacher. Oh, you know what? I'm writing XYZ article or a story or whatever I'm writing. I need to make sure that those principles are adhered to in my own work. And one of the interesting things about writing screenplays or novels or any kind of long piece is that they're like a Swiss watch. They are very much intertwined in the elements, and you have got to put those gears together where it meshes perfectly, or it will grind to a halt. That's true in storytelling for sure. Everything has to fit perfectly. So you need to remind yourself of all of these many elements that are in a story, that they all have to mesh perfectly. And you can forget that when you're first drafting something. And by the way, first drafts it's okay in a first draft to really be awful. First drafts are traditionally terrible. And so cut yourself a break if you write a first draft and it's not good. That's the craft of writing. The art of writing is in rewriting.
Have you ever seen a good first draft?
No. I've never produced one, and I've never seen one. I'm sure it must exist. I just have never seen one. Somebody is guaranteed over the course of time to have written a brilliant book that they did very little to other than maybe the lightest of polishes. Though I would be surprised by that. I think most writers have to work really hard at what they do. And so finding a perfect first draft is not likely.
That makes sense. So I'd like to talk about the show.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about how you came up for the concept for StoryBeat.
So in 2016, I did the first ever interview that I'd ever done, a legitimate interview. And that was live on stage for an hour at Point Park University with no less than Bryan Cranston. And that was the first time I'd ever interviewed anyone. And that was a quirk that I had that opportunity, and it fell into place very quickly, and it was just thrust upon me, and there it was, and I was glad to do it. But it was my first taste. And it was, I liked this. I didn't think I was great at it, but I thought, this is something interesting for me to do. And then a few months later, they opened a new facility on campus called the Center for Media Innovation. And the person that runs the Center for Media Innovation is a wonderful guy named Andy Conti. In fact, Andy has been a guest on StoryBeat. And he put out a call throughout the university for any professors that wanted to use their new radio facility, i.e. also a podcast facility, if anybody wanted to do a podcast. And I believe I'm the only professor who raised their hand and said, I think I'd like to try that. And I'd already written 2 books at that point, one called Beating Broadway and one called Beating Hollywood.
Right.
And they were about how do you create stories. And I thought, well, this is what I know and understand. It's my passion. I'll do a show about storytelling. The show has clearly expanded way beyond storytelling in its time, but it started out focused on storytellers on storytelling. That was actually the subtitle of the show early on. And I focused on the creative process early on, and that has remained. Mm-hmm. The show is still about creative process, much more so than people's history, though I get into a little bit of that too on the show. So it started with me going, how do I go from having done one interview to now interviewing people? The person who I looked up to, well, there were 2 of them. One was Charlie Rose, who's now fallen into sort of a little bit of disrepute, but his ability to interview people I thought was extraordinary. And so I kind of thought of him as a marker to work against how you interview people. And Mike Wallace, who I have never imitated in terms of the way that he was hard-hitting. I'm not a hard-hitting interviewer, but he was very thorough and he got at the heart of things. So I took that as a marker as well. So that's how I came up with the show, because Beating Broadway, Beating Hollywood, StoryBeat. So that's how that name came up, storytelling and beats. And that's where it all came from. And then to focus on creative process.
Got it. I love that your first formal interview was with Bryan Cranston. I mean, that is truly baptism by fire.
Oh, baptism by... Look, he helped because he's just about the nicest human who's ever lived.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. That's a relief.
He is just a real, and then I got to interview him a second time on the show.
Right.
So if you ever want to listen to Bryan Cranston, just search him in the all guests part of StoryBeat. But he is absolutely one of the most down to earth, nicest people ever. And part of that is because he spent, I don't know, 20 or 25 years as a journeyman actor before he was the least bit famous. Mm-hmm. And so he understood the notion of up and coming and trying and struggle. And he's not arrogant in any way. He puts on no airs at all.
He's humble.
He's humble. And he's certainly very famous at this point, but he doesn't come off that way. And I really had no clue what I was doing. In fact, when I look back on the first interview with him, I asked him one or two questions that he gave me funny answers back to because I'd asked the wrong questions. Part of doing a really good show, by the way, the same thing for being a really good teacher, asking good questions. How you phrase the question, how you form the question, and what it is you're asking are everything to what kind of direction you're going in, what kind of response you're going to get, and all the rest of it. And that took a little while for me to learn as well. Good questions make for good answers, and great guests make for good shows.
Absolutely. Do you remember the questions that you asked Bryan? Are these things that have kept you up at night that you asked him, he gave you the funny answers, and you're like, should have asked it this way?
The one that I remember is, the question was, what I wanted to ask him was, now that you are successful, do you still have to go through a challenging process to get a part, to get a role?
Huh.
And he looked at me like, no, I don't have, he said, no, I don't really have to audition anymore. And what I was trying to get at was, is it as difficult for him to do what he does now, to memorize lines, to get into the role? And I asked the question all gummed up. And when I did that, he gave me the answer that was the correct answer for him to give to the bad question.
Sure.
If I had asked him the question I should have said or asked was, when you are preparing a role, do you still have to work as hard at prepping the role now as when you first started out? That's the better question. And he would have then probably said to me, yes, I still work at it as hard, but I'm better at doing it now. He probably would have said something like that.
Right.
But that's not what I asked.
No, but that's a great lesson learned. And it's great, I think, for the listeners, too, to get a sense of what is a good question, what is a bad question, what happens when you ask these questions.
And it's the same thing with teaching.
Totally.
If you ask the students a question that doesn't help them or doesn't forward them or doesn't make them think, you're going to get an empty answer back. So that's very important too.
Absolutely. You had this experience with Bryan Cranston. You didn't really have hosting experience. And you mentioned Rose and Wallace, two people that you admired for their interviewing techniques. And I wonder how you prepared yourself as a host for this show. Did you take techniques from these individuals, or did you have your own way of preparing to be a host for a podcast?
So it took me a number of shows. If you go back and listen to the first shows, which I'm not sure I recommend anybody does unless they're just truly curious, because I was learning as I was going. Once I had information about a guest, then I started thinking, okay, well, what kind of questions can I ask this person about what it is they do in their creative process? And I think the questions early on were a little more general and a little less specific because I didn't feel like I could go there. I didn't feel comfortable about being too deep on certain subjects with people because I felt like, I'm going to be talking to them about something that's personal, though it really isn't. It's about their creative process. And so in the beginning, it was, I know a little bit about this person. By the way, part of the trick early on for me was asking people that I already knew, friends, because I've known and still know lots of people in the industry. And so I immediately went out to people who I knew would be easy for me to interview because I knew them personally. And that was a good way for me to break in and not feel overwhelmed by asking someone like a Bryan Cranston who I didn't know. And by the way, when I interviewed him the second time on the show, it was 2 years later. I built up to him the second time.
And I'm sure you noticed a difference the second time around with him.
Actually, the biggest difference the second time around with him, he had published a book. And what I did then was I really read the book actually for the second time. I'd read the book for the second time, and I pulled 90% of my questions out of the book. I then was able to ask him things that were not directly from the book, but it was triggered by the book. And so his answers were great because it was stuff he had already thought about and stuff that he had already said. And so I wasn't asking him things he had to think deeply about, which was really helpful. And that's true for lots of the authors that I interview. I make sure I read all these books. I've read close to 70 books at this point for authors that have been on the show. And I don't think I could do it without having read at least one book if they've published multiple books, so that I have a sense of the way that they operate and so on. I kind of need to get inside of their mindset a little bit. The one advantage I have is it's something that I've done for 50 plus years, as I said earlier. So I can relate to their anxieties and their successes and to how they produce work and what they go through. I can relate to it. So I'm coming at the questions, which again is the important part, is asking the questions. I come at the questions from experience, not as a journalist. I'm not a journalist. I don't have any experience with being a reporter. Though I do lots of interviews and have now done lots of interviews, I still don't think of myself as an interviewer per se. I think of myself as an interested artist in what others have to say about their particular experience, craft, discipline, etc.
I do want to peel back the curtain a bit for StoryBeat listeners. So the show is about the creative process, and I'm wondering what the creative process is for StoryBeat.
So like we've been talking about, the biggest thing for StoryBeat is there something that I need to read, look at, like a TV show or a movie? Is there art involved? Do I need to look at their art? Are they a composer? Do I need to listen to their music? Part of it is I need to know something about who it is I'm interviewing, if I don't already know. And then once I have booked a guest, or you've booked a guest, I then receive their biography and usually other materials about him or her, and I then start to create questions. Now, over time, I have developed a series of questions that if you listen to the show, you'll hear that I tend to repeat because I'm very interested in the contrasts of how one artist does something differently than a different artist does it. So by asking the same question, I'm able to get contrasts from one guest to another because no two artists do anything the same. They may do similar things, or there may be similar paths or similar methodologies, but everybody does everything a little bit differently. And I'm fascinated by, well, how do you do it? How does this person over here do it? How does everyone else do it? It's the reviewing their material and who they are, formulating questions, which, by the way, takes me days. When I say that, it takes me no time at all to formulate the first batch of questions. And then I look at those questions and work on those questions usually every day for 4 or 5 days before the show. Every single day I go through that. And it's the same with their bio. They send a bio because I don't want to write someone's bio. I want the guests to send me their bio. I want their official words. And then I will speak it aloud when I get it, which will be a week, 10 days before the show, the episode. And I will then speak it aloud. And by doing that, I will find where my tongue gets caught and where there's things I have trouble getting out. Because writing something is not necessarily perfect for saying something aloud. Reading something in your mind's eye is different from actually speaking those words.
Totally.
So I will then spend a little bit of every single day reviewing that bio, speaking it aloud, and massaging those words, sometimes removing whole sections because sometimes there's too much of it, and massaging it so I can get it down to under 2 minutes, which, by the way, is a hugely long period of time at the top of the show, which I luxuriate in. And some people think maybe it's too much. I think it's just right. That I love to explain to the audience who these people are before we start to talk. And that takes a little bit of time. It's different from the TV talk shows where somebody says, and now here's our guest, and they say one line about him or her, and out they come. No, I actually give a explanation of who folks are so that the guest has some kind of a built-up expectation in the audience as to who and what they are. But I do rehearse and massage that bio so that when I say it, and I still screw them up when I go to do the show, and we fix that later, but nevertheless, I'm pretty good at doing those at this point where I can just say them. And it's practice. It's again like anything else. That's the discipline. I don't just wing it. There is no such thing in Steve's world as to winging it. I've never walked onto an episode of StoryBeat knowing nothing about the guest, having never read the bio before, and just going. Now, I'm sure there are people that are good at that and can do it. Mm-hmm. That's not Steve. So I like to rehearse. I like to feel confident. I like to get into the show knowing in advance pretty much what the expectation of the answer will be. And then the last piece of it is, well, if there's two pieces, I tell every single guest that the show is a conversation about process. And I say, I try to make the show conversational. It's not a pure Q&A. I'm not going to give you a question and sit back and wait forever for you to finish your answer. I'm going to jump in on you. I'm going to push one way or another. And every guest gets that sort of explanation before we start. And sometimes it works out very well. And occasionally, not too often, I get guests who just like to talk.
Why do you think it's important for them to know that, to give your guests this heads up? So
that they don't think I'm being a horrible person and interrupting them.
Got it.
Because I'm going to interrupt them. And so I want them to know I'm going to interrupt you, and I don't want you to think I'm being rude. I'm telling you in advance I'm going to do that.
Because that's what we do in conversation as humans. Right?
Exactly.
It's natural.
Exactly. And I want it. And anybody who's listened to the show knows I throw my 2 cents in. I frequently will say, this is how it worked for me, and this is how I do it. And unlike a journalist, I'm inserting myself into the process conversation. And that's because I have experience doing it, and that's part of what the show is. And I think that's good for that to be bounced around during the course of the show. I think it's useful for the audience.
Yeah. I'd like to know about some of the challenges of putting together StoryBeat.
So I would say the first biggest thing was, can it be done? I was dealing with a studio on campus, so I was dealing with the notion of booking time, and that I no longer deal with because I work out of a studio in my home, and deciding what the logo was going to be, and more importantly, who's going to be on the show, finding people that are willing to talk to a novice, unknown host on a show nobody's ever heard of. That was challenging. Then deciding the form and format of the show. Am I going to do a show that's visual? Is it going to be video? Or is it going to be audio only? And I decided audio only was the way to go. I think it's a little easier to produce the show when you're not dealing with video. And I think that it requires a little less prep for the guest if they're not in studio with you. So they don't need special lighting. They don't need to get hair and makeup done, that kind of thing. So I think it's less challenging in what's already a challenging environment to put the show together. Then setting up a website, that was a big challenge. So that was time, and it cost money to do that because I had to hire someone because that was not my forte. And then figuring out which apps and platforms it could get out to and making those arrangements. That's a lot of work. And
it is.
I had to make a decision about music that we decided to use, intro and outro music. How does the show work? It was many episodes before we put the little teaser in at the top of the show. So those don't appear in the early shows at all. So there was a lot of finding the way over time. And now I think it's kind of settled into what it is. And maybe over time we'll make changes again. But at the moment, I think it's settled into the show is what it is.
I also just want to point out that before I was brought on about 5 months ago, you've basically been doing this all yourself. You're doing all the work, all the research, and you were editing too.
Correct. Other than we also have one person that we work with who I've worked with for quite a long time at this point, which is Mina Hoffman,
Yes.
who does all the social media stuff for the show. But she's been doing that for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years at least now. And also Holly Reed, who created the website and who web manages the whole thing. But yes, in terms of producing the show and editing the show and putting the show out, that was 100% on me for the first 6.5 years of the show. And it's a lot of work. I think it's one of the reasons why so many people don't stick to doing podcasts, because it is a lot of work and they think it'll be easy, but it isn't.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. So we just spoke about some of the struggles, but I'd like to hear some of the positives, some of the highlights of the show.
Well, it's always the people, isn't it? It's always the guests. The highlights of the show are because it's a people show, because it's unscripted. There's no special effects. There's no special anything other than the people. The people are the special effects. So it's always people like a Bryan Cranston and a Carrie Elwes and a Michael Dorn and Melody Thomas Scott and Phil Proctor and Norman Steinberg. My goodness, poor Norman, who is a friend who's no longer with us. Norman, who co-wrote Blazing Saddles and Johnny Dangerously and My Favorite Year. Dakin Matthews was a favorite guest to have on the show. Having Rob Marshall recently was amazing. Yes. Madeline Smith, my friend Madeline. And that's the other beauty part of the show as a highlight. People don't really realize it, I'm sure. I have purposefully included in the show lots of people that I know along the way who have become successful in one way, shape, or form. And they're friends. And it's such a joy to invite a friend onto the show and talk to a friend, not just someone who is known or does good work, which is also wonderful. But this is now a different level. So one of the highlights for me is when I have someone like Elisa Barnes on or a Kelly Ward on, people who are successful in one way, shape, or form, but they're also friends. Madeline Smith is someone I went to school with. Andy Tennant and I went to school together, and so on.
Yeah, and you're also going to have the best conversations too. I mean, they're going to unfold organically because these are people that you're comfortable with. You have a rapport.
Usually.
So it makes sense. Yeah.
That's correct. Now, one of the highlights of the show is that it has led to other things.
Sure.
One of the beautiful other things it has led to is I've been invited to be a guest on local TV shows to talk about certain things creatively. I have been invited to do live, you talked about it in the bio, that I have interviewed live on stage in front of large crowds, enthusiastic crowds, William Shatner and Carrie Elwes and Billy Porter. And so Billy Porter was in front of an enthusiastic crowd of students online. But
it counts.
Bill Shatner and Carrie Elwes were in front of 1,100 people in the same theater at different times. The show led to that. I would have never done that without the show. So that's a lot of fun. The other thing that's a highlight is making people laugh. I enjoy making people laugh and having them say, hey, I had a good time doing it. So that's a highlight of the show.
Mm-hmm. I mean, 6+ years, over 300 episodes now. Did you ever envision that you would be here, that you would be recording episode 301, 302?
Are you kidding? I wasn't sure I would get to 12. And so the fact that I'm sitting here having this conversation with you about 300 plus episodes is extraordinary and unexpected. And it's like many things in life, as you do things for a long period of time, you look back and you go, how did that happen?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I am right now. How did that happen?
So just looking back at episode 1, what have you learned along the way now that we're approaching 300 plus episodes?
So a lot of it has to do with being able to understand how to regulate time on a topic. The regulation of time within the show so that you can get a show in at a certain length. So early on, there were any number of shows, which occasionally happens to me, where it gets way beyond an hour, where it gets to be an hour and 10, an hour and 20 minutes, which is longer than I would like to do. It's because as the host, I'm not regulating it properly. I've learned how to make the show more conversational without stepping on the guests. I still step on guests too much, I think, but I've gotten better at not stepping on them as much as I did early on. Part of that is also a function of early on, a lot of the shows were done from this studio via phone, not through a video chat like Zoom. And so when you can't see someone on the other end of the line, it's very hard for them to tell when you're trying to break in on them, when you're trying to make a move. So I've learned that that's a little bit easier. So early on, I would have loved to have had Zoom available then, but it wasn't even a thing then. And what I have learned is that most guests, if you can get them to warm up properly, they will talk endlessly about themselves. And I've had any number of guests, especially friends, who I've convinced to come on the show. I'm not going to name names, but I can think of two in particular who I've convinced to come on the show who were very reluctant, who really didn't want to do the show because it's not their thing. And they said, both of them, actually I've had more than two, but I've had both of these particular people said, I'm not going to have anything to say for an hour. And when the hour has flown by and I say we were an hour in the show, they go, holy mackerel, how did that happen? Right? There's one of those how that happens. That they have, once you get people warmed up properly, they will talk about their process endlessly because it's what they do, what they know, and they're proud of what they've done and how they do it. And they frequently aren't asked those questions. They're asked other kinds of questions. And so I don't have anything to say for an hour turns into, oh, we could go on for hours.
Yeah. I'm sure that really surprises people.
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
People go, wow, that hour flew by.
Yeah. And they could keep going.
And they could keep going. And there are many times where I will have prepared 90 or 100 questions. We get to 22 of them, if that, and I could go on with them for hours and hours and hours. But
you got to call it.
You got to call it. I don't think there's anything good that comes out of going way too long. Short is better, and an hour is long to me, but it's still short compared to hours.
This is a great transition for us, actually. So I've been having a lovely, fascinating conversation with Steve Cuden, the host of StoryBeat podcast. I am Casey Georgi, hosting a very special episode to celebrate over 300 episodes on StoryBeat. And I would like to wind down the show. We've been speaking for about an hour now, Steve.
Holy mackerel, how'd that happen?
How did that happen? In all of your experiences working on this show, do you have a quirky, offbeat, oddball, weird, or just plain funny story that you'd like to share?
Well, and I'm not going to name names, but because the show is recorded and not put out live, and because the guests know it's recorded, sometimes guests do funny things knowing that we can cut it out. And so my favorite was a very, very well-known and successful writer twice during the course of the show said, excuse me, and got up and left to go use the bathroom.
Oh.
Twice.
Oh.
So I thought it was so sudden. And so obviously they had to go. When you got to go, you got to go. And
you got to go.
But it's like, you don't expect it while you're in the middle of something where you're doing what we're doing right now for someone to just say, oh. I had a very famous producer in the first interview we did, because I've done more than one with this particular person. They were at the end of their time and I didn't know it. They didn't give me a time limit. And they just suddenly said, gotta jump, and clicked off.
Oh,
and just
goodbye.
Just left. And so that was kind of a little disconcerting.
How did you end that show when it was so abrupt?
I had to finesse my way around it. I had to sort of finesse an ending, because I prefer to have the shows end on the guests rather than on me. And I've had people where their doorbells ring in the middle of the show and they get up to answer the door. I've had dogs barking in the middle of the show, and I've had guests where they have assistants, and in the middle of the show they realize something and they will yell out to the assistant, don't forget we have to do blah-de-dee-blue, whatever that is. So those are the quirky things that happen during the course of the show that I think back on and think that's, it takes all kinds.
Oh, yeah. And Zoom, too. It really reveals all. You really get a little window into people's personal lives as well.
It would be better, like, the primetime talk shows, it would be better, or the late night talk shows, I should say, if I had every guest come into a studio with me live. Mm-hmm. That would be better.
Right.
Having that person right in front of you, because at the studio on campus, when I first started, occasionally I would have local Pittsburgh people. They would come to the studio. Right. There's no substitute for that. Yeah. Zoom is a close second. The phone is a distant third. So yes, having that actual in face-to-face connection, there's no substitute for it.
So, Steve, you have given us so much wisdom and insight throughout the show, but of course, I'm going to ask your final question for the evening, and that is, do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip that you can lend to those trying to start a podcast or get their show to the next level?
Sure. First of all, it's okay if you want to do a very short-term podcast, like you want to write something and record it, or you want to just do a podcast where there's 2 or 3 episodes of a show. That's relatively easy to do by comparison. But if you want to do a long-term show, like we do StoryBeat, if you do not have a passion for the subject, you need to find the passion in it somehow. You have to have a passion for it, or you're going to burn out on it really quickly. And so I highly recommend that if you're going to start a podcast, that it be something that you really want to do. It's in your guts. It has to be. I said it earlier, I say it again. Great guests make great shows. And some people think I'm blowing smoke when I say that to them, because guests will say, I had a really good time, and I will say back to them, great guests make a great show, and that means you. And it's true. If I didn't have great guests, I could ask all the questions all day long, and they would just be questions. It's the responses back that make great shows. And here's my last piece of advice. Always make the guest look good. Making the guest look good makes you look good and makes them happy. So you always want to make the guest the star of the show. It's not about you. It's about the guest. They're always in prime position in my mind. I control the show. It's my show. I ask the questions. I control the timing, et cetera, but it's their show on that episode. And that's how I think of it.
I think that's really, really great advice. Steve, it's been such a pleasure and an honor to interview you on your show. And I want to thank you so much for your wisdom, your knowledge. It's been so great to have you on StoryBeat, and congratulations on 300 plus episodes of the show.
Well, wow. And thank you for doing this, and how strange it is for me to be on this side of the fence. And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.